couples therapy next on Retro Serial. Hey everyone, this is E&C. Thanks for joining me on today's program. We have reoccurring guest Dr. Brian MacDonald. On the last program, he talked about childhood development of Generation X, and on this program, he talks about couples therapy on Generation X. Now, normally we talk about entertainment and that kind of stuff, but on a few occasions we go into something a little bit more serious. And, couples therapy is one of those situations that are a little bit more serious, but this show is about growing up Generation X, and divorce was a big deal. It was a big deal for me. It was a big deal for my friends. A lot of my friends went through it. Some of them didn't, some of them did, but it was a big deal during this time. And so I wanted to talk about how couples therapy developed throughout the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even to today. So it's a really interesting program. Before we get to that program, though, please do me the favor of subscribing to the channel. I would really be honored if you'd subscribe. If you want to go a few extra steps, you can share this on your favorite social media. Let the other people out there know about this program and like it. What else? Oh, hit the bell notification if you're listening to us on YouTube. If you're not listening to us on YouTube, if you're listening to us on podcast format, please hit the like button, hit the share button, hit the ratings button. Give me an honest review. It means a lot to us here if, of course, you liked what we're doing. And, an honest review. I'm not saying give me, say this show's the best show in the world if you honestly don't think it's the best show in the world. So give me an honest rating. So it would truly mean a lot to me. That final step, whether you're listening to this or you're watching this on YouTube, is to hit the link below to the Buy Me a Coffee page. It's akin to Patreon, where you can donate some of your hard-earned cash to help improve things here at our studio and just show us some support and some love. So, all right, with all that said, let's go to the interview. Okay. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the show. I am on the Zoom call, back on it again with Dr. MacDonald, Brian MacDonald, who actually runs a gaming channel. You can see in the back of both of us, you have games back there. I have games back here. Tell us, I know you were on the program before and we talked about child development of Generation X, late 70s, 80s, 90s. And I had you back on this program because I wanted to talk about couples therapy, which was a big deal. But before we get to that, just tell us a little bit about yourself and about your gaming channel as well, so that people can go to that if they're interested.
Sure. Well, the channel is called Brains on Games, which is the Facebook handle and the Instagram feed and the Twitter page. Brains on Games is the YouTube channel as well. And it's a channel that I started when I had to close my practice. So I am a psychologist in private practice, and my work is primarily involving supporting kids with learning problems. And what I have been doing for ages is recommending that parents play with their kids, because play is very important for development. But as I learned more and more about modern board games, I found that board games were calling for certain kinds of skills. So if a child has some kind of a learning issue and they need to practice a skill, boy, it's way better to try and do that by playing games with them instead of doing drills. So Brains on Games is all about the learning skills that are promoted by playing different kinds of board games.
So instead of like doing flashcards over and over again, you can help them with games. I really do love the channel. I watch as many episodes as I possibly can. I can't say I've watched every single episode, but I do. If it comes up on my news feed, I certainly push the play button and I enjoy all of it. That was a really great conversation we had about child development and how that changed over the years. And you, as a fellow Gen Xer, know that Gen X has gone through some major changes. It's certainly quite distinct from the generation that went before it. And one of those things is divorce. divorce rates just skyrocketed through the roof. And I wanted to talk to you today because you're a scholar, you know how scholarship works, you're a psychologist. What was some of the attempts to and we can go through, each generation, like 70s, 80s, 90s, and we can even talk a little bit even before, that if you feel like that's necessary to kind of lay a foundation.
Right.
But I'm sure people didn't just say, hey, I'm out of here, see you later. They tried to work through it with psychology and getting, together in a room with a professional to kind of hash this out. I know that divorce exploded, and probably views on how to not make that happen, or how to if you have to do it, how to do it in the most gentle, loving way, that also exploded during this time. So with that kind of in mind, I'll let you kind of take us where you to the beginning of this, that kind of thing, however you want to see the conversation develop.
Sure. I mean, marriage is a super important topic. Now, I do my work primarily with kids, but what's the foundation of the family? It's the parents or the guardians, right? So
Yes.
that those adult relationships are super foundational, and those are the relationships that begin to teach kids about how people relate to one another, and whether the world is going to be a safe place or whether people are going to let one another down. Um, I mean, when we talk about couples therapy, it's funny that you asked me to talk about this subject because, well, I mean, I did my university a few years back, but originally I had planned on training to become a couples therapist. And that all changed once I started working with teenagers and found that I really, really enjoyed working with young people, and my audience. My clients got younger and younger and younger, and now I do work with younger kids and with their parents. But originally, when marital therapy or marriage counseling began, it wasn't really a couples interaction at all. Most therapists were meeting individually with people,
Really?
yeah,
That is super interesting.
they were addressing marital problems, and we're talking, pre 1960. They were addressing marital problems by seeing each individual person in a couple and working on whatever that person's issues were.
Okay, so do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea? Or you think maybe it could work in tandem with something else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a place for that,
Uh-huh.
sure. If the issue is primarily in the relationship, though, I think it's a good idea to get people together in the same
Right.
room,
So maybe
and
it's a
maybe.
bad idea if that's all you're doing. If that's all you're doing, that's a bad idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, bad idea. Maybe it's not the most efficient way of dealing with the problem,
Okay.
or maybe it's part of an overall solution. Certainly, change in an individual can have ripple effects in a family, right? So if
Right.
one person does something that's very different, that's going to kind of bounce off the other people. And the idea would be, if you're in individual therapy for anything, the idea would be that your relationships are going to change as your functioning improves.
Right. Okay.
And some folks would say there's some resistance to that, but we'll get to that part maybe. But yeah, originally it was kind of a psychodynamic sort of approach based on insight into the person's problems. And uh, even by the time 1960 rolled around, only about 15% of people who were doing marital counseling or marriage therapy were working with the couple in the room at the same time.
Wow, that's a low percentage. What kind of therapies were popular back then at that time? Was it like non-interruptive redirective therapies and things like that, or was it the Gestalt, or what was going on?
Well, it wasn't the Gestalt stuff sort of came along a little bit later, I think, in terms of working with couples, right? I
Okay.
mean, really what happened was therapists were working with individuals, and then kind of around 63 to the mid 60s or so, that's when they, some folks would call it conjoint couples therapy meetings were beginning to happen. And now therapists were working with the both spouses in the room together, and they were starting to work with them using a different kind of a model that focused on the relationship as opposed to the individual problems. And that really started to happen in family therapy. It was like family
Okay.
therapy kind of sucked up all of the marital counseling that was going on, because most family therapists were working primarily with couples. And that's something I found in my practice as well. You know, even if you're working with to help a child cope with the child's problems, often your meeting is going to be with the parents. And whether or not the parents' relationship functioning is something that's contributing to an issue, I mean, it may not be the primary issue, but you know, stress in the home can lead to problems in a relationship. And if you can sort of help families to sort out those kinds of issues, it can reduce stress, and you'll see everyone's problems kind of abate, at least to an extent.
Yeah, yeah.
You
That's a
know,
good point. Um, so let me ask you this, and then we'll get into the couples therapy. I got one more question about this idea of single therapy. So if I was a guy and I came to you during that time, and I was like, "Hey, I'm having trouble in my marriage," what models of therapy would have been implemented during that time where it was more of just one-on-one kind of a thing?
you'd be looking at your past and at your neuroses and doing dream interpretation, and it was psychodynamic. So not Freudian psychodynamic necessarily, but it was a psychodynamic approach. So it was certainly insight oriented,
Uh,
and you'd be looking at your unconscious needs that aren't being met. And it's I would say prior to the more psychodynamic approaches, it was more of an educational approach. Like, this is how successful marriages work, and this is what you need to do to have a successful marriage. And it was often preventative, and it might be a parish priest who was doing it, or a rabbi who was doing that kind of work, or it might even be an obstetrician who's working with parents on, this is how your relationship is supposed to be. It's not necessarily that there's a problem, but it's meant to prevent problems that might happen down the road. And then when it was more problem focused, the couples counselors sort of adopted a psychodynamic kind of a model where they were doing an analysis, dream analysis, and trying to interpret what was happening based on unconscious motivations and
Super
defenses
interesting. Yeah, I like
things
what you
like that.
said too about
Yeah, yeah.
I like what you said too about kind of like a functional, this is how it's supposed to work. You do A, B, and C, and you're going to get X, Y, and Z kind of a
Mhm.
thing. As somebody who's been in pastoral ministry in the past, that was at least a big block of what people really believed. It was kind of, you just grit your teeth, and if you're miserable, you're miserable, and you just, you made this commitment, and
Mhm.
you just do this, and feelings are for suckers, and and cultist, and you know and
Right.
and if you get some feelings at the end of
That's
it all, then great. um so I
You'd be surprised how often psychologists say feelings are for suckers. Well, they don't say that out loud, but they kind of imply it. It's funny how many psychologists do feel like that's a nonsense variable. It's just noise that's going to get in the way of doing the work. But
I see.
we're talking about marriage and love, right?
Right,
How are you
right.
going to not talk about feelings? Well, that's my
Well,
bias, I guess. But
yeah, and it's a bias of mine as well.
I
um
mean, I should say, like, I was married in a church, and I had to take a marriage course prior
uh-huh.
to getting married as part of that process. And it was all of that stuff. It was about, this is how a successful marriage is supposed to look, and this is what you need to talk about with your partner, and what you need to do in order to stay together. And it was just something that everybody did. And you kind
Yeah.
of went through this 8 week or 6 or 8 week, I can't remember how long it was. My wife might shout at me from upstairs, but 6 or 8 week program. And but it was with priests and nuns, right, who
Right.
were not necessarily speaking from experience of what a marriage was like, at least not in the Catholic Church. But they had, they were providing lots of information about how to help couples be successful.
I get that. I totally understand that. I think that the problem is in a lot of these things is just kind of, it's the isolation and then the almost deification of a certain ideal to the exclusion of others. It's not that you don't want to know, hey, what are the actual steps? It's that if that's all I have, then that becomes a real problem if we don't look at anything else. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it depends, I guess, on how it's presented and what it's presented as. Here's some ideas for
right,
what you need to do. Certainly, I mean, there's research that shows that there are good predictors of what things are going to tell you that a marriage is not going to work.
right.
Might be good to know about those so that you can watch out for those kinds of red flags, right? But we didn't talk a lot about that in my marriage course that I had to
Yeah.
take. Yeah,
Okay, so move us forward on the timeline then. Tell us, you said that it started being from individual to family therapy, and then from
yeah.
family therapy to when can we put a date on couples therapy, and when and what were some of the major books? And if you want to backtrack at all and talk about family therapy too, that's quite all right. But
Well,
go
in the
ahead.
60s, to say the mid 70s, there were a few people that were super influential, and they would be considered to be family therapists, but they were talking about couples therapy. And one of those, I would say, was Don Jackson, and he had some ideas that are still around. And honestly, when I was taking courses, if I was working with a couple as a student, when I was doing more, couples kinds of interventions, um, still some of these ideas, even though they were from the 60s to the 70s, were what we were using. Like, not exactly what Don Jackson talked about, but he had a couple of ideas that I think are interesting, and I think there's some of them, at least, are still around. One of those was this idea that families and couples are resistant to change. They have
Okay.
a thing that's called family homeostasis, he called it,
Hmm.
which was the idea that if somebody tries to change something about themselves or the way they do things, the other family members or the other spouse is going to resist that and want things to be back to the way they were. And they do that with these kind of unwritten rules, these unconscious rules that couples develop over time.
That's interesting. So I know that that happens a lot. I mean, it's an actual fact because, like, I've dealt before. I had a small business for a little while on weight loss, and I took on clients. And part of the whole thing with weight loss was, is this going to be okay with everybody? Because a lot of times they wouldn't, if somebody wants to change, like how they start eating meals, um, it affects everybody in the family, and they don't really necessarily want that person to, or they don't want it enough to change the behavior. At least, they
Yeah,
might
and you
say,
might see
oh,
that in addictions counseling too, with the group of friends of an addict. What all of a sudden he needs a whole new social group if he's trying to stop drinking or trying to stop,
yeah.
taking drugs. Right? It's a similar thing. That homeostasis. They want things to stay the same.
So in your opinion, how does that play into kind of the overall couples not getting divorced? Do you think it plays a major role in it, or a minor role, or somewhat in between, depending upon the situation?
Well, I mean, I think it's emotional responsiveness is the most important thing. What Jackson was talking about back in the mid 60s to early 70s was something he called the marital quid pro quo, which was again it was a sort of an unconscious set of behaviors that were about sort of each partner reassuring themselves that they were the equal of the other.
Okay.
So it was about sort of establishing some sort of a hierarchy, and how they define themselves within the relationship. I'm the one who does this, and you're the one who does that. And maybe those are rules that are out there and are conscious and spoken about among everybody, but a lot of the time it's not. A lot of the time it's just unwritten rules, and you might feel weird if those rules were broken, and maybe not even be able to explain why. I
Huh.
think one of the examples I read was, imagine if you invited a friend over for dinner, and you cooked a nice meal and you had a nice meal together, and then he offered to pay you for the food.
Yeah.
That would be a really strange, but we don't talk about, well, don't worry, you don't have to pay for it. It's just sort of an unwritten rule. If you invite someone to your house, but if you're at a restaurant, you may consciously negotiate that. Are you going to
Yeah.
pay for the entire table if you go out for a restaurant together? Is everybody splitting up their bills? So there are these kinds of unwritten rules in relationships, and that's what Jackson was sort of talking about. And his idea was to help people become aware of what those unwritten rules are, and to find rules that would work better for them if they're having trouble in their relationship.
Okay. All right. So basically it sounds like it's kind of an expectation kind of thing, like an unwritten expectation. And maybe two people don't have those same expectations. Like
Mm-hmm.
my expectation as a husband is that you'll do this, and the wife isn't so much, like maybe have grown up not even thinking about that as far as an expectation is concerned, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, you go into a relationship, and then what happens if both partners are working and one person expects the other one to be the one who does the cooking when they get home, and nobody really talks about it, and then they're just disappointed
Yeah.
that things aren't working out the way they expected, and then that just causes stress and resentment. So the idea of kind of becoming aware and talking about those things was important, and Jackson had interventions that were really about improving communication. And
Okay.
some of those techniques are things that are still used in therapy with families and with couples. One would be, I used to call it a speaker listener activity, but the idea that one person would try and explain what it was that was on their mind, or what was bothering them, or whatever it was they wanted to talk about. The other person had to stay quiet and until the first person was finished, and then the listener would sort of paraphrase what they heard to make sure they understood. And it was really about clarity of communication and making sure that you're not interrupting or jumping on the other person before their idea is clear.
Right. That makes sense, and I've even run into that too in doing the limited amount of marriage. Well, not too limited, but the amount of marriage counseling that I've done myself is like, okay, well, listen, you're not listening to this other person as far as what it is they are actually saying. You're like anticipating what they're saying, and maybe your
Right.
anticipation might be correct based
Mm-hmm.
on your life together, but it's doing damage because this person is not feeling like they're being heard, and maybe it's incorrect as well.
Yeah. I mean, if it's working, if things are working, it's fine, but you wouldn't be in therapy
Right.
if everything was working, right? So clear communication and listening and paraphrasing. The idea that mind reading is something that can cause problems. Like, you think you know what the other person thinks or how they're going to react, and you don't bring it up because you just think you know. And like
Right.
you said, sometimes you might be right, but a lot of the times you're not going to be right, because we're not very good at reading minds, unfortunately.
Right. And people tend to get upset even if the other person's right, because they feel like even though you're right, you're not hearing me out. And that's kind
Yeah.
of, yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of the last thing that I kind of took from going back and looking over Jackson's stuff was the idea of, if things are getting out of hand, if people are getting stressed out, if emotions are high, if conflict is starting, that you can end a meeting and come back to it when everybody's calm.
Yeah. Okay.
You
Well,
know, I had
cool.
a teacher who used to say, you mark it, you park it, you just leave it where it is. Remember, so that you don't forget to come back to it, and you come back to it when you're calm. Because nobody ever solved a problem when they were yelling at each other.
No, no, no. It doesn't make anybody feel good.
No.
Let's move forward then. I mean, I'm enjoying this. Let's move forward on the timeline. What was the next? Is there any breakthroughs or anything like that? What years and all?
Well, the next one was super exciting for me, and it was sort of concurrent with what Jackson was talking about. This idea of these unwritten rules and unconscious pro quo. But there was a therapist by the name of Virginia Satir,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
she's somebody who comes up in all the family therapy stuff. And if you've ever seen her videos, they're definitely worth watching. She's a real charismatic kind of a person, the kind of person you'd want to meet with and
Okay.
have as a therapist if you needed a therapist, right? She had that warmth and she could draw you in. And I mean, one thing that's interesting about Virginia Satir is that here's a person who was kind of renowned and influential, both in theory, in practice, in popularizing the idea of working with couples or working with families. And she's, I mean, at that time, how many female therapists were in that kind of a position?
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about 63 to 75 or so. So some of the things I read would say that she's, and again, we're still talking about her today. I mean, you and I are talking about her, but in courses that I take, she's still referenced now.
Yeah. Well, in every
Uh,
NLP book, she's referenced. That was a big draw for Ginder and Binder, whoever they were, the founders of NLP. You know, that was Virginia Satir is one of their foundational people who they look at to create change. So yeah,
yeah.
I'm not
Boy,
terribly
she used to do
familiar.
sculpting, and she would, well, one of the videos that I watched, because I wanted to kind of refresh my memory, because, you know, you kind of hear about her and the ideas that are being used now, but I haven't watched a video of Satir doing her work since I was taking courses 20 years ago. And it was such an interesting, it was a conflict between an adult child and her parents. And this woman was explaining how she felt. And Satir said, okay, you're talking about how you felt when you were small. Make yourself small. So she had to get sort of down on her knees as if she were a child and talk about how she was feeling. And in that position, she started to well up.
Uh-huh.
It just brought out all of these things, being smaller and bringing back those. It really made those memories salient of how she was feeling at the time. So it's certainly really interesting. I mean, family sculpting is not something I think that people really do nowadays, but here was a person who was talking about emotions instead of behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like
Right.
she was somebody who was willing to think outside the box too, you know, and somebody
Say
really,
so.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
who
I
could
mean,
get,
some of her critics would say that she's a bit too touchy feely.
uh, yeah.
And certainly things did move in the other direction, maybe after her work. But her idea was really a positive psychology kind of an idea, that it's not the problem that's the problem; it's the way people cope with problems that causes problems for them. So, and it's focused on strengths and what you bring to the table as opposed to pathology.
Mm.
Right?
Interesting. So was that, so then you mentioned that there was backlash, or I know that sometimes what'll happen is a trend will get set and then there'll be a reaction to the trend, then a reaction to a reaction, and then, you know, that the whole Hegelian synthesis and or thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of
Mhm.
thing. Did that happen with her at all, or? Okay, you dropped out.
I think there's a little bit. I mean, the male. Oh, are we back?
Yeah, you're back.
I can hear you. You can't. Okay, good. I mean, there was a backlash. Now, was that because of the work that she was doing, or her approach, or her philosophy, or was this because she was the woman in the field and all the other theorists were males and their models were cognitive, or they were they were more psychodynamic and they weren't about feelings? And the one person who's talking about emotions is the one female therapist, who's doing this kind of work. Um, and interesting again that she's talking about positivity rather than pathology. She's moving away from a medical model and towards this idea that um, that an individual is capable of change, that the homeostasis isn't automatic, and that if we can't change things outside of ourselves, then we can change the way we react to them.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, if we can be changed by the things that we can't change.
Huh.
Uh, and
Interesting.
we're in charge of our feelings. You know, all kinds of things that I think are still relevant now. I mean, you and I have both taken courses that reference her, and
Yeah.
even in the past year, I've taken courses and they still talk about her.
Wow. Wow. Well, she's had
Right?
quite an influence then. Both of the people that you've talked about so far had quite an influence. And it kind of seems like it's a piece of the pie, you know, of this idea
Yeah.
of mental health or mental health and relationships, you know. Um,
Well, and here was a therapist who was encouraging the couples in therapy to talk to each other, not to her.
oh,
It
wow.
was, don't say that to me. tell her, or tell your partner.
Oh,
Tell
okay.
your partner what that's all about, and use I statements. Now, we've all heard about I statements. If you know
Yes, we
anything about
have.
therapy, you've heard about I statements. Now, who's the person who's talking about I statements? Virginia Satir.
So it would be like, I feel that.
When this happens, I feel that. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly right.
Okay. When this.
Exactly right. And framing, framing the other person as having positive intentions for the
Mhm.
relationship, which maybe isn't universally the case, but is often the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to get along with the other person, but something's getting in the way. So lots of ideas that are still around. So she again talked about bringing out unspoken family rules. She felt like that was the therapist's role, to bring out feelings that aren't expressed. But she saw the therapist as being a warm and caring presence in those meetings, as being a, a nurturing teacher, I think, is the kind of language that she would have used.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Move us forward then after Virginia Satir, unless there's something more you want to say about that. What comes on? I want to eventually get to. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, but I
Oh,
know that's
yes. Okay.
a while, but from now. But I do want to get to that. One thing, let me just say this about Virginia Satir, is it sounds like, I mean, she comes up, but I didn't know. I mean, you've explained more than I ever really knew, other than she comes up as a name in NLP. But it sounds like she was really good at rapport and really good at getting people into state. When you talk about being a
Hmm.
child, being back there,
Hmm.
and that becomes important. Like, if you listen to Tony Robbins, walk like somebody who is successful, and do, you know what I mean? You get into
Yeah.
state. And it sounds like she was really super good at getting people into state so that they can
Yeah.
really understand those emotions, whatever they are, when they're little or older or
Hmm.
whatever.
Hmm.
Um,
To understand and express them too. And I would say that the reaction to that, I mean, there were a few different folks who reacted to that, but if we get closer to the present, Jay Haley was all about power and control, and that problems in relationships, or that symptoms, are psychological symptoms, are really serve the function of putting one person in control, or forcing certain things to happen. But Jay Haley, who talked about power and control, was someone who talked about the family as a system, that problems can arise, and systems therapy, right, is something that systemic family therapy is something that we learn how to do when we're learning about families. But really, the big reaction to Satir, I think, would be the behavioral marital therapy.
okay. So basically the recipe kind of thing.
Yeah, there was a real, yeah. So it was sort of based on, I mean, there were a few different people who were doing it. Probably Jacobson and Christensen, I think their names were, kind of started the process of
Hmm.
behavioral marital therapy. And
Is this is it
uh,
is behavioral therapy related to B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity? Are you familiar with that? Or that was kind of a
yeah, yeah,
behavioral idea, but I don't know how I know his philosophy a bit, but I
yeah.
don't I don't really know how that would fit into
I mean,
to.
Skinner was sort of the most purely behavioral theorist of them all, right? Like, nothing that you can't observe is important, which is a little tough in marriage counseling, right? Because there are some things that you don't necessarily see behaviorally. But he started that kind of school of thought, the idea that there are techniques, that there's a science of behavior, and that through that science, all the world's problems can be solved. If everyone behaved the way they were supposed to, we wouldn't
Right.
have any issues, right? And so that had an impact in lots of ways. And I do feel like, now, I'm not an economist, but just on my very, from reading Freakonomics and listening to their podcast and some other things that I've heard along the way, I do feel like he had an influence on sort of that idealized person that they used in models of economics, where a person is driven by reward, or
Uh-huh.
by incentives. And it turns out that human beings aren't necessarily only driven by incentives.
They're not necessarily
Rewards and
wired that way.
consequences. Yeah, rewards and consequences aren't always the only consideration. But the behavioral marital therapy almost took the quid pro quo idea
Okay.
that Jackson was talking about 20 years before. So this is about in the 80s. Took that quid pro quo and made it explicit, and made it like your relationship is going to work almost like it's transactional, like there's an exchange.
Yeah.
Like you make a list of the things that you wish your partner would do, and he or she makes a list of the things they wish you would do, and you do those things,
And that's
and you're
it.
exchanging
That's
positive things. That's the first part, and then there's skills training around communication and problem solving, and that's where the manual would come in, like a real curriculum of things that you do in your marriage. And they were finding that that was helpful for people who weren't having very serious problems, but it wasn't very helpful when people were having a really tough time.
real serious problems. Yeah.
Right. I mean, who's coming into therapy? Um, they added, so it kind of went through some phases. Then they added a phase that was about acceptance of the other person. So it wasn't just about, trading good deeds or about communication. It was also, about having positive regard for that other person. And then there was a phase that they added that was about working on yourself, the self-regulation part of therapy, where you'd work on your own issues so that you could be a better partner to the other person. And I mean, some people have said that those extra things didn't really make a huge difference to the effectiveness of that model of therapy. Um, I mean, all I can think of is that it couldn't hurt to add those things,
Right.
accepting the other person and showing your acceptance of the other person, and working on your own issues. It couldn't hurt, but there's not a lot of. I mean, there's research to back up behavioral approaches, but I wouldn't say it's one that even in my graduate work, which was in the 90s,
Uh-huh.
that that anyone really talked about. It was all
Yeah.
about family systems and about emotions by the time I was doing my work, and this was like 10 years after
Yeah.
this model started.
It's kind of interesting how things go through waves, like they'll get
Yeah.
popular, and there are some things that get popular and stay popular longer. And then there's certain things that stay popular, and then the ripple effect happens. People pick up on
Hmm.
those ideas, and then they improve on them and disregard other ones and stuff like that. It happens in all kinds of fields as
Sure.
well. I mean, it's kind of like the Bruce Lee effect. Like I'm an avid martial artist, and I do the Bruce Lee style. Jeet Kune Do is my main
Mhm.
foundational style, and I can go into a Shotokan class and really absorb what's useful out of it, but also not necessarily have to live by it by dogma. I can apply what's useful out of it, and it seems like that kind of happens, and then new ideas kind of spring up and new situations spring up and stuff like that causes you to think about things differently. I mean, we're facing a day right now where, not to derail the conversation to what's happening today, but parents did not my parents did not have to think about how much time I could spend on my cell phone. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? That wasn't an issue at all
Hmm.
for me. And so I can see how new situations would arise,
Hmm.
and then you have to rethink things. You can't just apply what was working in the past. In principle, maybe, but in functionality, you have to come up with some new ideas. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Or to the therapists, psychologists talk a lot about evidence-based practice, right? The
Okay.
idea that you use techniques, you use therapeutic methods that have been proven to be effective through research. And there's a psychologist who I like, who I feel like has great ideas about how families and how couples operate, by the name of Gordon Neufeld, and he's another Canadian psychologist, so maybe that's an extra reason why I like him. But Gordon is a believer not in evidence-based practice, but evidence-based theory. So you develop a theory that has lots of evidence to back it up, and that theory should explain the new situations, the unique situations that arise, and give
Huh.
you insight into how you should respond. So if the theory is that kids need to feel secure in their relationships with their parents and be close to the people who are caring for them, that gives you some ideas about how to respond when cell phones are kind of upending the hierarchy in the family, or are taking up all the time for the kids in the household.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. That does make sense. Um,
Yeah.
so okay, so let's move forward further. Let's get it. What year are we at right now?
Well, I'm going to talk about my favorite, and there's a reason why it's my favorite, and
Okay.
you'll probably understand as I begin to talk about it. And my favorite would be sort of mid '80s again, but carrying forward even today, and that is emotion focused therapy.
Okay. All right.
Greenberg, Les Greenberg, and Sue Johnson are the primary originators of this type of therapy, and it's been empirically validated to treat all kinds of problems, not just for couples, but to treat eating disorders and depression and anxiety, all kinds of things. But it is, a method that's used to treat relationships. And one of the reasons why I was excited to talk about is that Sue Johnson, one of the world famous originators of this thing, was one of my professors at the University of Ottawa.
Oh, cool.
So she was
Really
on my
cool.
dissertation committee, and so I had to have I didn't take her courses, but I had lots of meetings with Sue about attachment primarily, right? The science of
Uh-huh.
love, and about research and the research that she was doing. So I was excited in going through it that I was going to get to talk about Johnson's
Does she have a
model.
book out?
She has a whole pile of books. I think the
Okay.
most recent one that's not, to train therapists would be Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love. And there are some follow-ups to that. I think there's a Christian version, and she has a great web. You could Google Sue Johnson and you'll find all of the information about her. But
Okay.
7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love is a fairly recent one that really sums up her model of how couples operate and what they need to do to be successful.
Okay. So let's get into it. Let's talk about her. Let's talk about her models or her model.
Right. So her idea comes back to the notion that we talked about, I think last time we were talking about child therapy, the notion that all human beings are born with a need. They have a wired in need to have consistent, safe contact with a caring other person who's responsive to our needs.
Okay.
And if we don't have that relational security, it leads to high levels of stress and to problems with mental health like anxiety or depression. And she really wanted to distinguish herself from liberals, right? So it was sort of these, even though they were around the same time, they were
Sorry,
really opposing. She
she wanted to
emphasized bonzo
she wanted to distance
to
herself from
distinguish
what?
herself from the behaviorists,
Oh, okay. All right.
right? And so she said it's bonds over bargains.
Nice
So
slogan.
she always had a nice turn of phrase. She's when I live in Canada in Ottawa, and she was teaching at the University of Ottawa, but she's a British so she's a British lady who could say she came up with anyway, she had a way with words, and that's why she's written so many books, and she could do what she could do because she really does have a way with words. I like that, bonds versus bargains.
I do too. So,
But what she,
go ahead. I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, flesh it out for me a little bit, but maybe you were already going to do that. Flesh that out. That's a great idea. How does that translate into, I'm feeling disrespected by my wife, or
Mhm.
or something like that. How does that play out? I mean, I know that we can't have like a super therapy session,
Right.
mock therapy session, like mock trial. So,
Yeah. No, we won't go that route. And I haven't been trained in EFT, so I wouldn't even try to do that. But her sessions would be things like very present focused. So she would have the couple in the room with her, and it was very focused on what was going on in the moment. And maybe in some ways, like Satir, eliciting emotions, unexpressed emotions, and bringing them into the therapy meeting, not just to talk about, but to experience. and
Okay.
to have the other partner recognize and respond to those emotional expressions to repair attachment injuries and to heal the wounds that kind of pile up over time when we're having problems in our relationships.
I liked what you said there. Heal attachment um, uh, wounds.
Yeah.
That's great. That means so much to me because there is this a need for this attachment, and then you basically get wounded in that for some reason or another due to whatever expectations or unrealistic
Hmm.
expectations, or
Hmm.
the fact that we all are fallen and we don't do everything we're supposed to do all the time, whatever, and that has to be healed, and that happens between husbands and wives a
Uh-huh.
lot. Whenever you
Uh-huh.
have two people living together who can have different ideas about things and different personalities and different uh, differences, you're going to
Yeah.
have you want this attachment, and you're going to have these wounds that happen as a result of not getting that attachment, or getting that attachment severed. uh,
Right. And I mean, hopefully those wounds are minor and they're easily healed. And you're, when you recognize that something like that has happened in a relationship, you can respond to it. And that's what allows couples to move forward. But I mean, that doesn't always happen,
right,
right?
yeah. Sometimes
And it's
divorce
those,
happens, sometimes divorce,
well,
sometimes.
sometimes divorce happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily, and what I like about Sue Johnson and Les Greenberg's work is that there's lots of research to back it up, not just to back up what she's doing in a therapy meeting, but to back up the ideas that she's proposing. So she's, all these other approaches are focusing on skills training or focusing on insight into the problems. And what she'll cite research that says, well, successful people who are successfully married, who have a happy marriage and have been married for many years, aren't necessarily more skilled or more insightful than anybody else. So what's the difference between a successful marriage and an unsuccessful marriage if it's not skills or insight that all these other approaches are emphasizing? And instead, it's emotion decreasing affection and reductions in emotional responsiveness, where you sort of, say whatever, or the classic of the husband, leaving the house when the wife is upset about something instead of trying to be there for her in those instances.
Yeah. Okay. So you were saying some things there, and I was tracking with you, and it just kind of slipped my mind. But uh, you said it wasn't just insight. It
Uh-huh.
was. It was. Do you kind of remember
It
what you?
it wasn't just insight. It's the responsiveness,
Okay.
the emotional, the ability to respond appropriately to your partner's feelings that is the best predictor of a successful marriage later on.
Okay.
It's not even the amount of conflict. She talks about. I wrote some notes here so I could remember all the names and the studies that she talked about. But the idea that if partners aren't responding to one another's feelings, that is a better predictor of how solid a marriage will be 5 years later than how much conflict is in that relationship.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, this is an analogy that I ripped it off from somebody, but I probably have used it many times. And that is, you've gone over to people's houses that have kids and it's trashed, and you've gone over to people's houses that have kids and it's immaculate. It's not like kids are less kids. It's that the mess gets cleaned up right away, rather than
Mm-hmm.
rather than letting it linger for any period of time. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that the kid is, maybe in some type of strict home, but you know what I mean. I mean, the kid's gonna spill on the floor as much. He's gonna leave his toys out sometimes or whatever. And it's not that the kids aren't doing anything different. It's that you're cleaning the messes up as they're happening, rather than, oh my gosh, these messes have been happening for a week now, and now the place is, now we all got to spend our Saturday cleaning up. And I think the same thing kind of happens in marriages too, where it's not the amount of, oh, well, you didn't take, whatever the offense might be or the perceived offense might be, it gets taken care of on a more regular basis.
That's key what you said. Perceived offense, because it doesn't necessarily have to be something that actually happened. It's just if you believe or if you're worried that it might happen. It's not just those attachment injuries can happen not just through your action, but through something that might happen or anticipatory anxiety.
Yeah, oh, yeah, participatory anxiety. That's a good one. Uh,
Right.
for sure. Well, I deal a lot with, or have dealt, haven't lately, but have dealt a lot with this idea of perceived. Like you'll see an action, a fact. It's a fact that the husband came home late, or it's a fact that
Mm-hmm.
the wife, and then what accounts for the fact is the theory, is the narrative you associate around it.
Mm-hmm.
Is the narrative you associate around it that this person just maybe forgot, or that it was, or is the narrative, I wasn't important enough for you to get home on time? That's a narrative too, that explains the facts. You know what I mean?
And are you aware that those are the feelings that you're having? Like
Right.
that awareness that that's what's driving it, right? And so Sue and EFT would focus on looking for those patterns. And she uses a dance metaphor very often. So she talks about how, one person does a move and the other person follows along. That there's a functional dance and there's one that can be more toxic or more damaging. And for example, if one partner is kind of defensive and sort of distant and not responsive, and the other person is trying to bang on that door, that pursuit withdrawal, where one person is chasing after the partner who's running in the other direction for whatever reason. So you get a critical and aggressive partner, and the other partner who's like shutting down and not wanting to deal with it, because if they dealt with it, what would happen?
Yeah.
And so she sees those dances happening and helps couples to recognize them, and to recognize that if they're in therapy to save the relationship, then there's something there maybe that they want to save. So they have to reconnect with one another somehow, and recognize what's happening inside of them, recognize those patterns that are happening, and the emotions that those patterns bring up, and then in order for them to be to find new ways, to find new dance steps, maybe would be what she would say,
Yeah.
in order to relate to one another and show that you care about one another and have that security. Because what happens if your partner comes home late and maybe they just forgot, but you're anxious about what that means? What were they doing? Who
Yeah.
were they with?
Yeah.
Right. And then
Right.
that's an attachment injury, but it's not because of something, there was an event, but it's not really the event that's causing the issue. It's your anxiety about what if things aren't as stable as I thought they were. It's such a challenge to deal with the fundamental fact that we can't be 1,000% certain that everything is going to last forever.
Right. Right.
Even in a secure relationship, right? You sort of have to cope with the futility of fulfillment, that if things are okay now, they may not always be okay in the future. And we all have to deal with that feeling.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like she has combined a good this type of therapy has combined a good recipe action type of behavior, but based on this idea that those behaviors have to come from this emotional place, this emotional ideas. I don't know if I'm getting, if I'm summarizing it right. It is, in other words, okay, so you have this happens in philosophy a lot. You have the two things. You have the facts, but you have the theory. And some people they focus on the facts, and other people kind of focus on the theory. And some people say, no, you got to have the facts, and then your theory is going to result from the facts. And some people say, no, you got to have the theory, and then out of the theory you build your behavior. And it seems to be this eternal conflict. And she seems to have solved that really well, at least the way you're explaining it to me.
Well, I mean, it certainly is an approach that she wouldn't say it's focused on any kind of behavior, but the idea is if you're empathic and caring, and the other person can see your caring and empathy, then all of the behaviors that follow from that are going to be, towards that relationship security as opposed to away from it.
Right, right.
Right?
Okay,
Which is
we're coming up a little bit on time, but
okay.
I mean I have as long as we need really. I'm more worried about as far as you're concerned. And I mean this you taking time to do this really super means a lot to me.
Well,
Um,
I appreciate your inviting me for
Oh,
sure. It's
oh
fun.
yeah, for sure. It's awesome to talk to you. But I do want to get to the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing. But if there's anything in between that you want to touch on, go right ahead.
I mean, that was really the only other thing because I would say now based on a not quite a layperson, but not a person who does couples therapy and being living in the city where Sue worked and has an institute for excellence in emotion focused therapy and has a couple and family therapy institute, where I am, where I live, EFT is the kind of dominant way of helping couples deal with marital strife. Um, so other approaches maybe exist or have developed over time, but EFT is the one that I'm, most familiar with just because of where I live and who did the work in the city. Now, men are from Mars, women are from Venus is an interesting one, right? Because that was such a popular book at the time when it came out.
Yeah. I wasn't even into really couples therapy when it came out or anything like that. But I mean, I who didn't hear about it? You know what I mean?
It was everywhere, and there were follow-up books and Mars and Venus in the bedroom and Mars and Venus here and there and everywhere, right?
Right.
So John Gray like had a whole industry really about men being from Mars and women being from Venus, and I think that it comes from some stereotypes, some gender stereotypes, and it comes from maybe a, a, maybe an incomplete understanding or a different reading of data that shows, the normal curve for men in different areas and the normal curve, the bell curve, the statistical, the statistical, I
know.
can't think of the
I
word.
know which word you're looking for. Analysis or
the,
something.
yeah, so the statistical spread, like height is normally distributed. Most people are in the middle and there's a few people on either end. And the same with many other things. This curve that's shaped like a bell, they call it the bell curve in statistics. And men and women overlap on almost everything except there's a little shift. So you might say, well, men are better at this than women are, but really it's only like the 1% of men at the tail end
Right.
so it's not really accurate to say that. This guy, John Gray, who created the industry, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, was a guy who did take correspondence course in psychology, degree in mediation.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. That and that is a lot of what that is kind of almost like a negotiation kind of thing. And realizing that this, and they said men are from Mars, women are from Venus. The idea was that this person, they speak a different language almost. And if you
Mm-hmm.
care, you will learn how to speak their language and learn that when they're speaking their language to you, that it's not necessarily an insult. If a
Yeah,
guy wants to negotiate and a girl wants to help, she's not, the guy's not being mean because they want to negotiate instead of help, because the idea, I guess, is that's the way the guy is wired. And the girl goes, how come you don't want to help? You want to negotiate? I said, let's go do this. And you said, well, I already did this. And, I think if I'm understanding it right from the lectures I've heard on it, it's kind of
yeah.
basically that, but go ahead and fill in the gaps for me.
The woman in the couple might say, I just want to be heard, and the man might want to solve the problem. Or really, I think my reading of it, and it's been years since I looked at that stuff, because it was really a pop psychology thing. It wasn't anything that had an impact, I don't think, in a major way on marriage counseling or anything like that. But it did have an impact on kind of the popular understanding of how couples operate, at least for a little while. Otherwise, he
Yeah.
wouldn't have sold so many books, right?
Right.
And been on Phil Donahue or whatever show was on at the time. I'm trying to remember back to those Gen X talk shows. But
Ricky Lake.
Ricky Lake, sure. So the idea, he kind of wrote in stone that pursuit withdrawal pattern, that the wife wants to talk and the guy wants to retreat into his cave and doesn't want to have discussions about things, because men don't talk about feelings. And that's just the way we're wired, because we're from Mars and we're competitive and warlike. And women are the empathic understanders. But I mean, if that's how your relationship works, it's going to be a challenge, right?
Yeah, that would definitely, certainly be a challenge. I think
you talk about mind reading.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you're stereotyping your partner into and putting them in this box.
So you're from, and this is the way you're going to be acting all the time, when it's much more three-dimensional than that. Mm-hmm. I find him a fascinating character, the guy. I've actually listened to him on other things. He was on, I don't know if you ever listened to him on Bulletproof Radio. I don't know if you're familiar with Bulletproof Coffee or the Bulletproof Diet or anything like that.
Yes, I know about Bulletproof Coffee. Sure.
Yeah. Well, he's been on Bulletproof Radio, and that's actually, I mean, I'd heard about him back in the 90s or whatever, when the thing came out. But I started listening to him like more recently because he was on Bulletproof Radio, and he's a big proponent of Dave Asprey's, stuff and products and things like that. Mm-hmm. And Dave Asprey's had him on the program talking about relationships too, and it kind of piqued my interest, going, oh, okay, all right, I didn't know that's what that was about. I had no idea, but I was interested, not interested enough to pick the book up and read it, unfortunately. I've got other books I have to read, so
sure.
But that's why there's experts like you out there, that I can call and say, hey, tell us about
well, I will not pretend to be an expert in John Gray's ideas about how relationships work. But if anybody came to me and said, can you recommend a book, or can you recommend some videos, or a theorist who knows about marriage, or who could help me make my marriage better, I would always recommend Sue Johnson.
Yeah.
Always. Yeah. Even before she was my teacher, I would have recommended her.
Okay. Where do you see, two final questions and we'll wrap it up. I want to know where you see marriage counseling headed in the future. And that's, yeah. No, let me ask my other question first. So that one's going to be on the end. Were there any therapies that came out that didn't get any traction at all, that you can think of, that came out during that time? Was there any ideas or anything during the Gen X period that came out and you were like, that should have got more traction, or it didn't, and you're glad that it didn't? Either way.
Well, I think one thing that maybe, I mean, Sue talks about it in her work, or at least in the underlying theory that drives her work. But I think some of the psychodynamic stuff around object relations is something that would be the thing that maybe should get more traction, in my opinion, because that is about the idea that you develop a model in your mind of how people are going to react to you or respond to you, and that model affects your interactions later on as you get older. Mm-hmm. And so if you had a parent who was not very responsive or who wasn't very warm, then you wouldn't expect people to be like that, and you might be surprised or suspicious if someone is affectionate towards you. And so there are some more recent evolutions, I guess, of the psychodynamic kind of approach to couples therapy that focus more on those things than on some of the other stuff. And I think attachment is really, really important. I think that's going to be the answer to a lot of things in psychology. The way I feel it should go, I mean, my bias is that there's a natural capacity within us to be functioning members of society who can retain our individuality, but still be in relationships with other people, relationships that are secure, that work. And the therapist's job might be to help remove the obstacles that prevent that development from occurring, whether it's a lack of insight or awareness, or whatever the problem might be. And Sue's approach works towards that, but I think that's definitely the way. That it's not necessarily the expert who needs to tell everybody exactly what to do, but it's a way of seeing the other person that's going to allow you to know what to do.
Well said.
Whether we're talking about our partners or our kids.
Right. One final, I forgot, but this brings us definitely out of Gen X, but it is probably the last book that I kind of read on it, and that was The 5 Love Languages. Did you like that book? Did you read that book? Or
it wasn't something that I looked at. I mean, all I read now are board game manuals, as you can tell. But when I'm not doing coursework, so yeah, I've been doing coursework and virtually attending lectures, as opposed to doing a lot of reading of the textbooks. So
you have to read to be on the show. I have to, like, I feel bad when I was like, hey, get on the show. And then you're like, okay, I'm giving him homework to do. And as somebody,
you gave me lots of homework to do, but it's good. It's homework that I should do.
Yeah.
Never hurts to refresh your memory for that stuff that you studied way back when.
And I think anybody who's actually gone all the way through school kind of in a way likes it a little bit. You really, it is a career choice to, get a PhD or a doctor of divinity or whatever. But that's, everybody can stop at like a master's, you know what I mean? You had to go, there's something more I want after this, Yeah, so I think the self-torture of study is something we like a little bit.
Yeah, we must, right? We did put ourselves through it,
right? For sure,
for a long time. So we're really good at focusing on reading, and ignoring everything else for a little while at least.
Well, thank you, Dr. MacDonald. Let me just once again ask you to tell everybody about your channel and your sites so that they can look those up and hopefully get you some more subscribers. And then stick with me on the program after I close it out. I would like to talk to you just briefly off air, if you don't mind just taking a couple minutes.
Sure, no problem. So brainsongames.ca is the website. Brains on Games is the channel on YouTube. It's the Facebook page and the Instagram feed and the Twitter handle as well. So if you search Brains on Games, you should be able to track me down. And they're generally short videos about games that you can play with your kids or with one another that emphasize the skills that you're developing by playing them.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us today on today's program. I'm Ian C. You've been listening to Retro Serial or watching Retro Serial, depending upon if you're on YouTube or on podcast format. If you would not mind hitting the subscribe button, it's a small step for you, but it really means so much for us here on the channel. If you want to go a couple extra steps, you can smash the like button, hit the bell notification, share it on your favorite social media. And if you want to spend some of your hard-earned cash on seeing improvements here on our program, follow the link below to the Buy Me a Coffee page where you can donate some of that hard-earned cash to what we're doing here, to building my YouTube mogul empire. If you're on a podcast, please leave me an honest review and a rating. It would mean a lot to me. And if you are on podcast, I post all these on YouTube plus a little bit more. So there are some things that don't quite make it onto the podcast, but are on YouTube. If you like what we're doing here on the podcast, you'll definitely like what we're doing on YouTube. There's just a lot more stuff that's more visual that doesn't quite transfer over to audio only. So head on over there and hit the subscribe button and hit the like button and all that good stuff. All right, thank you so much, and we will talk to you again on another episode of Retro Serial.